Good afternoon. We're here on Poet, Writer to Writer with translator, publisher, poet James Cates. Welcome. And recently James has published a translation of the poet Allegrim?
No, Aigerim Taji.
Allegrim Taji, paper thin skin. She's a Kazakhstani poet? Kazakhstani poet, and she writes in Russian.
She writes in Russian.
And so tell me, I know you translate, no, you didn't, but I know you were involved in translations of Akhmatova.
Akhmatova. I did not do the translations.
Yeah. So I've
been translating Russian for 30 years now.
Okay. So you felt in your element doing this, obviously.
I feel in my element translating Russian poets with whom I have a connection and an affinity. And I've been translating a number of Russian poets over the years.
For instance, who have you been, I don't know if I know them, but...
Mikhail Eisenberg, Tatiana Sherbina, Sergei Stratnovsky, Mikhail Yeryomin, contemporary poets.
Yeah.
Contemporary poets, a lot of them. Nikolai Baitov, I have. And Aigerim Taji is the latest of those poets that Words Without Borders asked me to translate one or two of her poems for a feature they were doing 7 years ago. And I liked the work, and I asked to do more, and she and I have been working together ever since.
Well, I think you wrote somewhere that you're usually more comfortable working with people of your own generation. She's a lot younger. How was that?
Well, it's not a question of being comfortable. It's sort of, I share a lot of the same persuasions, as I say. We sort of, there are a couple of younger poets that I've translated too. Her work is very, very different from my own poetry, but somehow there is a congeniality. There is a way of a conversation.
How is it different from your poetry? I mean, I've read your poetry.
It's very different. I mean, in that the tone tends to be different. She tends to have a more undercurrent of spirituality and of connection with her own cultural Kazakhstani world, which I don't share at all. And I mean, her images are the images of the steppe and of her country there, and her concerns tend to be her observations of her own world are not the same observations that I have of my world. That's the best way to put it.
A different sensibility.
I mean, it's difficult to be abstract about it. The best way to do is just to read books, my work, and read hers, and to see that. And
you had the advantage of her being alive. I mean,
sometimes that's an advantage when you're translating. Sometimes it isn't.
How so?
Well, when you translate the dead, then they can't argue back. Taji is a poet who is a lot of fun to work with because she engages. She has enough English to engage in the translation process, but knows her limitations or accepts limitations too. So we work very well together. We've never met.
Never met?
We've never met.
Skype or anything like that?
No Skype, just email.
Oh, okay. And she's a teacher there, or?
No, she's not. In fact, I don't really know what she does besides write poetry.
Good gig if you can get it.
I don't know. I know she's married, but she doesn't talk much about her personal life, and I don't ask a lot about her personal life.
Okay. Now,
both of us, one of the things we do share, we do agree on, is we think that if you're a writer, your writing should speak for you, not your biography.
Okay. All right. And that's why I didn't read your biography.
There is none.
Now, there's been I was reading you saying there was recently, not recent, I mean, I don't know, decades, maybe a couple of decades, there's been a switch where women are now more recognized as writers in Kazakhstan. I'm never going to get it right, but anyway, go ahead. What would you say? Has there been a switch in society now?
I don't know enough about the society as a whole to be able to say that. I know in general, in the last few years in Russian poetry, there has been a lot more attention than there used to be on women writers in Russian language poetry. They've come into their own in a way that they hadn't before. And I don't know the literary scene in Kazakhstan very well at all.
Okay. Now, translator friend of mine, Ron Kalman, I don't know if you ever heard of him, he lives in Brookline, but he told me to ask you. He said, because, when you translate Russian poetry, they get very upset if you don't get the rhyme right or something like of this nature. What were you saying?
I have a set speech about that.
Oh, is that a common question? Or?
It's a very common thing. It's a very common question. But first of all, Russians do. The simplest thing, if we're going to talk about Russian poetry, is that when the modernist revolution hit Russian poetry, it did not hit form the way it did in Western poetry. So that very avant-garde modern Russian poems are still written in strict form. But if you translate them into strict form, you're aligning yourself in English language poetry with a kind of neo-formalist movement that is very far from the mood and the tone of the originals. So you have to know when you can translate the form as well as the content of the poem into the right language, the right kind of language. And sometimes it's very appropriate to keep the strict forms, and sometimes it's necessary. And sometimes it's very necessary to loosen it up or to change it.
And you, in fact, have to add words in order to make the poetry flow that might not have been in the original form.
Well, you're always changing words.
You're always changing.
You're not speaking the original language, so the words are going to be different, yes.
And that's a difficult process, I imagine, too.
It's a process. I mean, I don't know whether it's difficult or not.
To keep the integrity of the poem.
That's the aim. That's the aim in the game, is to try to get across as much as possible of your reading of the original poem when you translate. Remembering that and sometimes you read a poem differently at different times, and your translation, you make two different translations that don't look alike, but they both look like the original. Yeah, I mean, that's what translation is finding new words to in the new language, in the other language, to try to bring as much as possible of the original poem across.
And I noticed in her poems, she really gets into like the essence of things. I think you were touching on spirituality, childhood. I think on page 41 she had a poem about. You bring that out there. About she got sort of the I don't know how to describe it, the essence of childhood with just a few words. 41, I believe it was. Maybe you want to read that.
Windows opening to the east. Summer beats behind the curtains. The pillow smells of recent sleep. Sunday morning, childhood. A key turned in the stiff lock. Who's coming there now, shaking his shoes off? In warm pajamas, wearing a single sock, run up to him without stumbling.
Just because that wonder is a venture of a child, because they're not having all that baggage. They just sort of, these lines. I mean, you have any comments about that?
No, in fact, it's kind of funny when you translate. Is that I get so close to the words of the poems and to the poems themselves. I don't.
You lose the big picture.
I don't think to talk about the poems. I'm sometimes surprised when I will read a poem that I've translated, and people say, "Oh, that's really powerful," and I've been so far inside it.
Did you have that epiphany now?
No, not with this particular poem this time, but I've been so far inside the poem that I don't necessarily hear it the way the reader hears it. Although that's, of course, what I'm trying to get to when I do it. But it's like writing when you write your own poem. You're inside it,
right.
And you need the reader to bounce off, to give you the feedback, to give you. No poem is complete without a reader to make sense of what it is you've written.
Now, I was going to ask you about I read, you sent me a manuscript of your Briar Patch poems. A lot of great poems in there. I liked one that really hit me hard, was there was this, you were talking about some woman who died, and she was like a cat at the door, then stumbling down the stairs. I mean, can you give me some background on that?
There's no background to that. That's all fiction.
All fiction.
Oh yeah, I just made that up.
Yeah, that's great. I mean,
It was an image and an idea that came to me that created its own.
But you had the exact dates, I think,
Yes.
you had of her death.
Yes,
Yeah.
oh yes, I made those up.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, you always have to separate the poet from what he's, not necessarily autobiographical.
Right. Yeah. That's complete fiction.
Yeah. And then,
I mean, I like the poem too, but I like it very much as a poem. But it's complete fiction as much as any poem is fiction.
well, of course it's fiction. I was just
Yeah,
thinking
yeah.
if you had any particular woman or mind.
Nothing.
Or
No.
no. No.
Not in
Some
that
woman
case.
who was curious. Well, yeah. No. All right. All right. There was another poem that I noticed. You write a lot about the New Hampshire woods.
I write a great deal about living in New Hampshire, so much so that I sometimes
Where'd you
worry.
grow up in? Just out of interest.
I grew up north of New York City.
White Plains, right?
Elmsford and White Plains, but at a time when that was a lot like, this was before the New York Thruway, a lot like the way southwestern New Hampshire looks now.
Really? Okay.
It was the Elmsford that I grew up in was rural.
Right, okay.
But I sometimes worry about getting sort of tagged as a country poet, as sort of as one said, when the frost is on the bumpkin. And I have one chapbook which is mostly built around New Hampshire country poems, and I'm very comfortable with that. But I sometimes crawl away from it a little bit because, and in fact, I've started writing for the fun of it, trying to write some prose poems and deliberately trying to put those in urban settings to try and do something new, to break out and be different.
And the one you had where you were chopping a tree, and it was sort of like, it was a metaphor for. Do you remember this one where it was sort of a metaphor for America and this aggressive?
Oh, well, that's a poem I love to read.
Yeah. Oh, great.
Do you want me to read it?
Well, actually,
no.
Yeah, no. I want you to read. I think you do have some time to read from your work. I know you don't want to mention Zephyr, but that's a big thing of yours. Just in the final question. Well, actually, before that, I want to ask you why, because I notice they do this in the New York Times. I think it's a good question. Why should someone read your book, your translation here?
Because the poems are good.
Right.
Because they're good poems. If people want to read good poems, they should read good poems. Either this or another book, but I think they should read this one. And maybe also it's a window into another culture. Whenever you're reading any translated work, you're learning a new culture. You're learning something new in a way of thinking, in a way of speaking that you're not normally exposed to. And Americans are not exposed enough to literature from other countries.
Okay.
Which may segue into your question about Zephyr, because Zephyr focuses on publishing literature from other countries, and we consider that an important mission. I don't like to talk about it in a situation like this because it tends to absorb too much of my energy and my time when I'd rather be talking about my own work, but it gets eclipsed by my work with the press.
But just suffice to say that it's been going for 47 years, won a plethora.
40 years, yeah.
40 years?
40 years, yeah.
And a plethora of awards, et cetera, et cetera. So you're also have done a great job there. So I want to, what's the matter?
No, I'm not. Yeah.
No, I don't want to dwell on it, too much, because I know. But so I want you to have a chance to read your poems is what I want. Why don't you said you really like reading that one about chopping the tree.
Well, I do like reading it. There's a little bit of a difficulty. I discovered, though, that when I read it aloud, that people mishear the first syllable, which gets repeated through the poem. Mm-hmm. So if I read it, I have to specify that the word is thock, T-H-O-C-K.
Oh, not the other word.
Not a word that people tend to hear.
Okay.
It's an onomatopoetic. Do you want me to read that? Do you want me to? No.
Whatever you want.
Well, no, I'm just saying.
I mean, that would be nice.
It wasn't what I was planning on starting with, but since you brought it up,
all right.
It's kind of fun. It is actually, by the way, the only poem that I deliberately did not read at one point. I was planning on reading it at a reading that I was giving in Central Square, and
be the perfect place to read it, I thought.
Yes, and it happened to be the night of the opening of the first campaign of the war in Southwest Asia.
So this was in the 70s, 60s.
No. This was in the 80s.
Oh, I thought you were talking about Vietnam.
No, I'm talking about Southwest Asia. I'm talking about the Iraq thing. But somehow it wasn't funny that night.
Yeah.
And I couldn't read it. It may not be funny now, but it's Woodpile Machismo. And it's a poem that comes out of being this kind of intellectual kid who suddenly discovers, knows what it's like to split wood.
Very good.
Woodpile Machismo. Fuck! And my maul splits birch so white it's no skin off my nose, but like the exposed fictional thighs of a pornographic lover, virgin, pale and languid, blonde too, I respond. I am maple, ruddy and rough. Hey, buddy, you better believe it. Fuck! I cleave it all, beech, hickory, oak, and send it up in smoke. Fire and sex all the same to me, a splitter's game. I'm bigger than you, and I wield a heavier axe. My eye is true and blue, my passion hetero, and my nationality American. Fuck! I got a belly like rock, an arm like a goddamn song, and I'm never wrong.
It's good. You read it wonderfully. Some people get up there with a monotone, and it could be a great poem, but they destroy it, by just, not bringing any drama to it or theatrics to it at all, And I think, no, I'm just commenting on that, yeah.
Well, thank you.
So go ahead. You have actually 14 minutes to read from your work.
Okay, so, I was going to begin with the poem that gives the briar patch its name, which no longer has a name, although once upon a time it did.
Oh, who's the publisher of this?
This is published by Hobblebush Books.
Okay, I never heard of them.
Sid Lee in New Hampshire.
Okay.
It's part of a wonderful, actually, series that he does of Granite State of New Hampshire poets.
Okay.
Now Kirsty has taken over. Rule number 1, everything is attached. In the briar patch, whichever way you turn, somebody gets scratched. Rule number 2, your eyes bleed when they are plucked out and weep when they are stuck in. Proceed accordingly. Your oldest friend needs that woman, that job, no more than you do. Friendships mend if they are meant to. Have some fun. Make some money. Get what you can. Above all, look out for number 1. Other poems from this book. This book is a manuscript that was actually put together out of scraps from another manuscript. Here's a poem, one of my very few Jewish poems. I have a couple
Jewish?
of Jewish. Oh yes.
Oh, what a Lunsman. Okay.
This is called Chief Joy, and it has as its head note, "If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy." Christ, I wish I could write in Irish, deal down rhymes to rout black rats, harp on the wind across green fields, and glory in heroes with singing shields. I curse my father for the name of cats. Jesus, I'd like to write in English and carol the queen of the azure snood, or chase rare birds and country maids, and sigh to death when the twilight fades. But I've been cheated, screwed, and Jewed. Father omnipotent, Welsh and Scottish straight-laced lines my tongue could savour and sing in kirk and chapel, I'd prefer in my mouth on a stony hillside instead of this licorice Eastern flavour. I hear America singing, Lord, the lawless songs of 1,000 tribes, hymning and humming in rhythms of jazz the wonders of new utopias, and scorn for Pharisees and scribes. Israel, hear my present anguish. Forgive me for the craft of longing. The promise is no substitute for certain country underfoot and the impossible belonging.
You know, there was a poem where you have a character on the boat with Sharon ferrying to hell. And, you know, you're sort of, well,
That's a
Dante
translation.
was trying to convince him to go to hell. You know, he said it was God's will. But you were trying to explain, you know, I don't really regret anything I did for love, basically.
Well, that's a translation. That's a translation. I translate.
That's a translation by who?
That's a translation of a French Renaissance poem.
Oh, okay.
I
missed that.
Yeah, I like. I translate French Renaissance sonnets just for the fun of it, to chew on. This is by Olivier de Magny.
Okay.
Ahoy, Sharon, Sharon, you ferryman to hell. Who is it who summons me with such insistent fervor? It is the exhausted, weeping spirit of a faithful lover who has suffered only ill for loving all too well. What do you want of me? Passage across your river. What is the cause of death? A question all too cruel. It is love that killed me. Into the dark valley I will never ferry those whom love commands, never. Sharon, for pity's sake, please receive me in your boat. Look for another pilot, because neither I nor fate defies this master of the gods, he whom all must fear. I will go in spite of you, for within my soul love has such dominion, and my eyes so many tears, that I will be the river and the ferry and the pole.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a fun kind of thing to do. One other poem I was planned on reading was The Axe Murderer's Daughter. And this does have a root in a real person's story.
Oh, thank God.
The Axe Murderer's Daughter. The axe murderer's daughter got a brand new yellow tutu and satin slippers for her 8th birthday. And today is every other Saturday. Time to visit with her mother where he lives. Ever since the accident, she was too young to remember, almost. How she hates the long drive, the iron doors and corridors, the dirty little room where 3 bored men watch her mother talking to him, 2 girls fidgeting. What is she supposed to think about the stranger she's supposed to love for her mother's sake and Jesus? She will stop visiting when she goes away to college, but write faithfully every month. He will learn about her own 2 children, her divorce, her move out of state, her new home. She will give instructions to the chief of police. There is always talk of budget cutting, of letting the safe ones out. If he ever shows up in town, shoot on sight. But today she will dance for him in the dirty metal room to canned music borrowed from her teacher. She will wear her yellow tutu and satin slippers, her mother, sister watching, and 3 bored guards. And he will watch her too, saying afterwards, "My little girl, that's my little girl."
Yeah, you got about 4 minutes. So.
Okay. I like writing poems in other people's voices.
Okay, persona poems.
Poems, other voices.
Yeah.
This is Woman of the High Plains. The ground boils here, but slowly, not like the water in my pot stripping a cooked chicken to bone and soup, separable identities. It takes, they say, 9 years or more for a man to render down to broth, and then his skeleton can be picked out and thrown away. My husband now would pinch the soil each spring and taste it for the planting, knowing what it needed until it needed him. And I don't know, oh yes, I would like to read this poem. This is the music box. A lot of my poems, or some of
What book is this from?
this is from a chapbook called Mapamond,
Okay.
my first chapbook.
Wow.
And this is the music box.
Okay.
Another one of those hard cases flicks. The moral ambiguity of ex-Nazis and their ignorant children. At the exit, a thickish woman with a silver cane blocked my way, asked me to explain the final scene her imperfect English couldn't keep up with. I was born in Munich, 1914, brought up after the war. She held my arm, encouraged by courtesy, and continued with the glittering eye of an old sailor. And all these things are true, and worse. All of it I saw. I come to this country 15 years ago when my daughter married an American. She wore a gold medallion at her throat, a thick coat. I shivered in the cold. A delicate lid lifted of itself, the same small figures dancing round and round, and all these things are true, and worse, while tiny hammers pinged out tinny notes, turning me mechanical to the refrain of my inhuman brain. Well, and you, and you? But 2 months earlier, on the Moscow train, I sat beside a soldier my own age, clearly Vietnamese, who smiled brightly and recognized in me the foreigner I know I am, and asked where I was from. America, I said. He buried his head deep inside the hollows of his hands and did not look at me or speak again.
Well, you got about a minute. So if there's anything really small.
Yes, here's a riddle.
All right.
Here's a riddle I'll leave you with. I strike 11 times at 12. I am bought and kept and reckoned with gold. I am to your ear what the new moon is to your eye. Say my name and break me.
Thank you, James. I was going to ask you, so you have anything coming up, readings, events?
I wish. If people will invite me, I'll read at the drop of a hat. I love to.
Well, maybe we have it at the Newton Free Library next some. Yeah,
Well,
next,
I haven't read in the Newton Library for years. I read there many years ago.
when it was at the other library, or it was at a different. Yeah, it was Robert K. Johnson probably ran it then.
No, I forget. There was an anthology reading many years ago, and then a couple of other things.
Thank you very much, James, for joining us.